Marion Bartoli lived two lives that seemed impossible to coexist in one person. One life unfolded under the lights of center court, where she had to turn every doubt into motivation, where the two-handed forehand, the two-handed backhand, the jumping movements, and the unusual playing style constantly subjected her to scrutiny. The other life took place far from the scoreboard, where no umpire announced that the pain had become large enough and no trophy protected her from insecurity. Just over a month after winning Wimbledon 2013, Marion retired at the age of 28 because her body could no longer withstand the demands of professional tennis. After that, she had to learn how to live when rankings, the tournament schedule, and weekly goals all disappeared. In Marion's own words, a relationship after retirement further damaged the way she saw her own body through criticisms about her weight. Her weight changed dramatically, and by 2016, Marion publicly spoke about a health crisis that made eating and daily living difficult. At times she admitted she feared for her life, feared that her heart might stop beating. But the will that had carried her through thousands of hours of training remained. When preparing for a comeback, Marion's goal was no longer simply to add another title. She wanted to prove to herself that she was still alive. That was Bartoli's double life. A woman the world saw through victories, and a woman who had to fight in silence so as not to lose herself. Yet those pains could not obscure the scale of her career. Bartoli once rose to number 7 in the world, finished 8 consecutive seasons from 2006 to 2013 in the top 20, won 8 WTA singles titles and 3 doubles titles, along with more than 11 million USD in career prize money. At the Grand Slams, she reached the Wimbledon final in 2007, the quarterfinals of the Australian Open in 2009, the semifinals of Roland Garros in 2011, and the quarterfinals of the US Open in 2012. She had defeated top players such as Justine Henin, Serena Williams, and Victoria Azarenka. The peak arrived on the 6th of July 2013, when Marion defeated Sabine Lisicki 6-1, 6-4 to win Wimbledon without dropping a single set in the entire tournament. That trophy did not merely confirm Bartoli's talent, it proved that a woman could be seen as too different, too strange, too unlike the familiar model, yet still be strong enough to become a champion. Before moving on to the next part, please hit like and leave a heart in the comments as a sign of respect for Marion Bartoli, the woman who turned the things that once made her doubted into the strength to stand at the top of Wimbledon. I'll mention this just once. I've gathered these unforgettable sports stories, trivia, and memories into a book called The Golden Age of Sports Trivia for Seniors. If it sounds like something you'd enjoy, the link is in the comments. To understand why Marion Bartoli could stand firm through many years of skepticism and finally lift the Wimbledon silver plate, one must go back very far, before center court, before the rankings, and before the tennis world even knew her name. Marion was born on the 2nd of October 1984 in Le Puy-en-Velay, France. Her father, Walter Bartoli, was a doctor rather than a professional tennis coach, following the usual path. When Marion began holding a racket around the age of 6, Walter did not have a ready-made formula recognized by the major academies. He only had the ability to observe, patience, and the belief that his daughter did not need to resemble any other player in order to go far. One of the images that strongly influenced him was Monica Seles, famous for using 2 hands on both sides. Walter saw in that a quality suited to Marion, using 2 hands to increase stability, take the ball earlier, exploit quick reflexes, and reduce the opponent's preparation time. From then on, he built for his daughter a very personal style of play, with a 2-handed forehand, a 2-handed backhand, a position close to the baseline, and a heavy reliance on timing. Walter did not care whether Marion's game looked beautiful by traditional standards. What he cared about was whether it suited her. If Marion did not possess the same qualities as other players, he did not regard that as a shortcoming. He found ways to turn what she had into advantages. It was here that the father-daughter relationship began to be bound to tennis far more deeply. Walter gradually shifted from the father who took his child onto the court To the person who studied every detail of the game, observed every reflex, every footstep, every moment of contact with the ball, and every instant when Marion lost rhythm, tennis gradually became a shared language between the two of them. In those training sessions, Marion did not only learn how to hit the ball, she learned a lesson that would follow her throughout her career. Being different does not mean being wrong, but anyone who chooses an unusual path will always have to endure more skeptical glances. That was both a gift and a burden. Having a father who believed in her absolutely gave Marion enough courage to keep her own style of play. Yet the further she moved away from the common standard, the more easily she became the target of questions about technique, style, and the father standing behind her. Later, the public would see the two-handed strokes and consider them strange. They would see Marion jumping, swinging the racket, and keeping her body constantly in motion between points, and ask why she did not resemble other players. But for Marion, those were not random actions. They were the product of many years built around reflexes, intensity, and the ability to maintain concentration. The more Walter invested in his daughter, the harder it became to separate the boundary between father and coach. Marion's success was therefore increasingly viewed through the lens of him. When she progressed, people spoke of Walter's methods. When she encountered difficulties, those same methods were brought into question. Marion would have to live for a very long time with the reality that in order to be recognized as herself, she first had to step out from the shadow of the man who had helped create everything she had on the court. But in those early years, neither of them thought that far. Walter was still only trying to help his daughter turn an unusual ability into something strong enough to survive in professional tennis, while Marion was still a little girl learning to believe that she did not need to be like the majority. Neither of them could know that that method would one day take her to the Wimbledon final and finally to the championship. They also could not yet know that that different path would force Marion to prove herself longer, endure more skepticism, and pay an ever greater price. Because once the style of play had taken shape, the next question was no longer whether Marion could play tennis in her own way. The question was how many years, how much discipline, and how much of her youth she would have to devote to turning that way of playing into a career the whole world could not deny. From then on, tennis was no longer merely the sport Marion played after school, but gradually became the structure surrounding nearly every day of her life. Training sessions followed one after another. Junior tournaments, trips, and hours of repeating the same movement caused Marion's childhood to be measured more and more by the tournament calendar than by free time. The father and daughter did not always have perfect training conditions. There were limited practice courts, moments when they had to make use of whatever was available to continue sharpening reflexes, footwork, timing, and concentration. Precisely within those limitations, Marion grew accustomed to turning shortages of conditions into problems that had to be solved rather than reasons to stop. She learned to take the ball early, stand close to the baseline, maintain a high tempo, and keep her mind locked onto every point. The high-performance sporting environment also made Marion understand very early that mistakes always left traces. A missed shot could become the opponent's point. A game of lost concentration could change the direction of an entire set. A loss could affect ranking, the draw, and the next opportunity. Therefore, progress in her world was increasingly measured by concrete numbers, points, victories, rankings, and results at each tournament. Marion was not a child completely stripped of childhood, but tennis gradually occupied more of the spaces that could have been devoted to an ordinary life. Trips were often tied to tournaments. Rest days had to take recovery into account. Weeks were organized around preparing for the next match. The longer she lived in that environment, the more she developed a particular competitive personality. Marion always wanted to know what she had just done right, where she had gone wrong, and how she had to adjust immediately. On court, she rarely allowed intensity to drop. Between points, she bounced lightly, swung the racket, kept her arms and legs active, and simulated the movements as if the body always had to stay ready. To later spectators, those actions could look strange. To Marion, they were the way to maintain concentration, reflexes, and match rhythm. No detail in that style appeared by chance. It was created from countless training sessions without spectators. where a young girl learned to repeat until the body remembered before the mind. That same process also made Marion highly analytical. She did not only want to win, she wanted to understand why she won or lost. She observed the opponent's position, the timing of every stroke, the foot rhythm, and the small changes that could alter an entire point. A little girl who had once been taught by her father that being different does not mean being wrong now began to understand something more. If she was different from the majority, she would have to provide more evidence for others to believe in that path. That made Marion stronger, but it also made every defeat carry extra weight. A loss did not only say that she had not played well enough on that day, it could also make outsiders question whether the entire method the father and daughter were pursuing was correct. Therefore, Marion gradually grew used to competing not only against the person on the other side of the net, but also having to endure the skepticism surrounding her. As she approached the professional world, her game already had a clear shape. 2 hands on both sides, taking the ball early, quick reflexes, a rapid tempo, and a level of concentration that almost never rested. In the world of Walter and Marion, everything had a reason. But when that style of play began to appear before spectators, the press and people accustomed to a different model of a top player, Marion was about to discover that difference could help a person gain attention very quickly, yet to be respected she would have to pay with many years of proving that she deserved it. When Marion entered the professional world, the difference that had been built quietly during the years of training with her father suddenly became something the entire tennis world could see, analyze, and debate. She was no longer merely a young girl with an unusual style of play. She became a player with increasingly better results, appearing more and more at major tournaments, and with every step forward, Walter Bartoli also became more clearly present in the story of his daughter. People saw him in the stands, at practice sessions, in the way Marion prepared for matches, and in a series of career decisions the father and daughter made together. For many other players, coaches can change from one stage to another. For Marion, Walter was almost part of the entire system. That made her career special, but also made it hard for outsiders to look at Marion without simultaneously seeing her father. Questions gradually arose not only about how high she could climb, but also about whether Walter's methods were too unusual, whether the bond between father and daughter was too tight, and whether Marion could develop if she continued along a path that did not resemble the conventional coaching structure. The more success she achieved, the larger those questions became. What pained Marion was not necessarily the skepticism about her tennis, because she had lived with it from very early on. The greater difficulty lay in the fact that many people began interpreting her herself through the father standing behind her. When Marion won, people spoke of the system Walter had built. When she lost, those methods were immediately called into question. When controversial decisions arose, the story easily became what Walter wanted, what Walter allowed, what Walter controlled, while Marion was the one who had to walk onto the court alone, receive every serve, face every break point, and live with every defeat. That relationship became especially sensitive when it touched the structure of French national tennis. Marion wanted Walter to continue being present in the preparation process in the way she believed was necessary for her, while the national teams had to operate according to their own coaching systems and regulations. Disagreements related to the Fed Cup dragged on and later affected the conditions for her to qualify for the Olympics. To outsiders, a top player placing such large demands around her father's presence could look like a hard-to-understand dependency. But Marion saw the matter differently. Walter was not someone who appeared when she had already succeeded. He had been there before anyone knew who she was. He had given up most of his career as a doctor to invest time in his daughter, accompanying her through the years without titles, the little-known practice courts, and the periods when nothing guaranteed that all that effort would lead to a major career. Therefore, Marion repeatedly defended her father against descriptions she felt were too simplistic or unfair. She did not accept the idea that Walter was merely a man controlling his daughter. In her experience, he was the person who had believed in a version of Marion that very few others saw from the beginning. That is what made their father-daughter story both beautiful and difficult. If Walter were simply a bad coach, Marion could have left. If he were simply an authoritarian father, the story could easily be divided into right and wrong. But the reality is far more complex. He was the one who helped create the foundation that made her strong enough to stand alongside the world's top tennis players, while that same overwhelming presence also made it increasingly difficult for Marion to have a professional identity completely separate from him. She had to endure a paradox that very few people could see from the outside, wanting to protect her father, but also wanting to be recognized as herself, wanting to keep the system that had helped her rise while at the same time having to prove that the victories did not belong only to the person who designed it. That is a silent burden because tennis is by nature a solitary sport. In the decisive moment, no father or coach can step across the baseline and hit the ball in Marion's place. Walter could prepare tactics, observe, encourage, or warn, but when the match began, Marion had to live with every decision of her own. And the closer she advanced toward the group of top players, the clearer the difference became between the public image and the inner experience. Outsiders saw a strange father-daughter pair. Marion saw years of sacrifice. Outsiders saw a coach standing too close to his daughter's career. Marion saw the person who had laid the foundation for almost everything she knew about tennis. But deep beneath, one question grew harder and harder to avoid. At what point would Marion Bartoli be seen without Walter standing in the same sentence? The first answer began to appear in the summer of 2007. Wimbledon, the most prestigious tournament in tennis, became the stage where a style of play once considered unusual, a path once doubted, and Marion herself had to face a greater challenge than all the external debates. Because as she advanced deep through each round and stood before the finest players in the world, no one could argue on her behalf any longer. If Marion wanted to prove she was not merely Walter Bartoli's daughter, she would have to do it in the only way tennis truly recognizes, by winning matches that no one thought she could win. And in the summer of 2007, for the first time Marion Bartoli had the chance to answer all those doubts not with words, not by defending her father before the press, but with the only thing Wimbledon truly recognizes, victories. On the grass courts, the style of play that had once made many people find it unusual suddenly became dangerous in a very clear way. Marion took the ball early, hit flat, stood close to the baseline, and continually stole the preparation time of her opponents. On a surface where the ball travels fast and moments of hesitation are punished instantly, that helped her create almost constant pressure. Without needing classic beautiful forehands, without needing to look like the champions who came before, Marion began advancing through each round with the very game that she and Walter had spent many years building. Every victory made the question about her difference less a matter of mockery and more a matter of genuine curiosity. Then Marion reached the semifinals, where Justine Henin awaited her, the world #1 and one of the most feared opponents of that time. For most spectators, this seemed like the natural limit of the journey. Henin had Grand Slam experience, technical refinement, and a status that Marion was still trying to reach. But precisely in that seemingly unbalanced match, Bartoli produced one of the most important victories of her life. She endured losing the first set, did not let the match slip away, then began clinging to every ball, raising the tempo and forcing Henin to play with less and less time. Marion came from behind to win 1-6, 7-5, 6-1, and when the final point ended, something had changed forever. She was no longer merely the unusual player with the unusual father standing behind. She had just defeated the woman ranked #1 in the world to step into the Wimbledon final. At the age of 22, Marion stood before an opportunity that many athletes never get in their entire lives. Only one match between her and the most prestigious trophy in tennis. The opponent was Venus Williams, who already understood center court in a way Marion had never had the chance to experience. Venus was stronger, more experienced, had already won Wimbledon, and possessed a power on grass that could change a match with just a few serves. But for Marion, this was not merely a final. It was the culmination of thousands of hours of practice, of the years Walter had given up a normal professional life to accompany his daughter, of the questions about technique, about physique, about whether the father and daughter were pursuing a path too different to reach this place. If she won, everything could crystallize in a silver plate. But tennis does not care how beautiful a story is. Venus won 6-4, 6-1. Marion had to stand on the other side of the net watching the dream end, not in the first round, not at a small tournament, but right at the final match, right where the trophy was close enough for her to see it clearly. That was not a humiliation. No one could call a 22-year-old player going from a position of doubt to the Wimbledon final a complete failure. But precisely because Marion had gone so far, the pain took on a different shape. When you lose early, you can tell yourself you were never truly close. When you lose in the final, you know exactly how great the distance is between yourself and what you want. Only one match, only a few games, only the moments that, if they had gone differently, an entire life might have been remembered in another way. Marion left Wimbledon with an entirely new status. She had proven she could defeat the world number one. She had proven that a two-handed style did not prevent her from standing on the biggest stage. She had proven that the years with Walter were not a hopeless experiment. But at the same time, Wimbledon 2007 also placed in her a question that the runner-up title could not resolve. What if this was the greatest opportunity? Tennis does not promise that someone who has reached a final will return. A season can be diverted by injury, a difficult draw, an opponent at peak form, a ball that clips the net cord, or simply by time. Marion was still young, but in elite sport youth is not a guarantee. She carried from London an achievement large enough to make the world look at her differently, but she also carried the memory of having stood so close to what she wanted most, and still having to leave without it in her hands. The most cruel thing was that she could not know at that moment that she would have to wait another 6 years before standing again in a Wimbledon final. 6 years to keep fighting, keep proving, keep watching other players lift the trophies she still did not have. Wimbledon 2007 gave Marion the proof that she was good enough to reach the final match, but it gave her no promise that that door would open again. But Marion Bartoli did not disappear after the summer of 2007. If that had happened, perhaps the pain would have been simpler. One time touching close to glory, and then stepping back. A beautiful but short story. What was far more difficult was that she remained good enough that she could not abandon hope. Year after year, Marion was still there, still forcing her way into the late rounds of the majors, still defeating opponents who made people remember that she had never left the conversation about the finest players in the world. In 2009, she reached the quarterfinals of the Australian Open. 2 years later, at Roland Garros 2011, Marion advanced to the semifinals, proving that her game had value not only on the grass of Wimbledon. In 2012, she again reached the quarterfinals of the US Open. Between those Grand Slams were countless weeks in which Bartoli kept herself in the top group, finishing many consecutive seasons in the top 20, and finally rising to the highest ranking of her career, world number 7. Those numbers were enough for any player to be proud. But for Marion, they were at the same time a form of reminder. She did not lack results to the point of being able to accept that the Wimbledon final of 2007 was merely a beautiful accident. She also did not dominate the tour strongly enough to know for certain that a Grand Slam title was only a matter of time. She was trapped in the most painful middle ground, good enough to believe, but not yet lucky or perfect enough to reach the final match again. Precisely because of that, each major victory both healed and made the old wound ache. Marion once defeated Serena Williams at Wimbledon 2011, a victory that showed even against one of the greatest opponents in history, the style once considered unusual could still create tremendous pressure. In 2012 in Miami, she ended Victoria Azarenka's streak of 26 consecutive wins, the player then ranked number 1 in the world and almost unbeatable in that period. Matches like those did not allow Marion to tell herself that she simply did not belong at the highest level. On the contrary, they made the question even more persistent. If she could defeat the best players on a big day, why did the Grand Slam trophy still remain out of reach? For an athlete, hope is sometimes more exhausting than disappointment. Disappointment can close a door, Hope forces you to keep standing in front of it. Marion kept boarding planes, kept changing hotels, kept training, kept adjusting her game and returning to the tournaments where she knew a few bad points were enough to end months of preparation. The years from 2008 to 2012 were not years of failure. On the contrary, they were the period that proved she belonged to the elite of women's tennis. But precisely for that reason, they also became the years that did not allow Marion to easily let go of the greatest dream. Each time she went deep into a Grand Slam, the memory of having stood in a final returned. Each time she defeated a top player, she gained further proof that she could still return. And each season that closed without the major trophy arriving, time took away another portion of certainty. An athlete's body does not stand still for 6 years. The schedule does not pause to wait for anyone. The long-haul flights across time zones, the changing surfaces, the prolonged matches, the recovery sessions followed immediately by preparation for the next tournament silently accumulated into the price of always remaining in the game. At that stage, there was not yet any need to call it physical collapse. Marion was still competing at a high level, still having weeks that made the entire tour weary. But time had begun to leave its marks, as it always does with every professional athlete, and she continued because the opportunity had not completely disappeared. Walter remained inside that familiar structure, continuing to be the person deeply attached to the preparation and career of his daughter. The father and daughter had walked together from the small practice courts to the position of world number 7. Those results proved that their system was not a mistake. But at a certain point, the very thing that had helped Marion survive began to pose a new question. If she had been good enough to reach the quarterfinals in Melbourne, the semifinals in Paris, the quarterfinals in New York, to defeat Serena and end Azarenka's winning streak, but still could not return to a Grand Slam final, did the answer lie in continuing to do everything exactly as before? This was no longer a debate about whether Walter was right or wrong. What he had helped Marion build had clearly placed her among the finest players in the world. The more difficult problem was that a structure could be right for many years and still no longer be the most suitable thing for the next step. At the beginning of 2013, Marion was 28 years old, no longer the 22-year-old girl who first stepped into a Wimbledon final. 6 seasons had passed, carrying impressive achievements but not yet delivering what she wanted most. She had proven she was good enough. She had proven that her difference could survive at the highest level. What had not yet been proven was whether she could cross the final boundary. And to find the answer, Marion was about to have to do something more painful than any technical change. Step out of the father-coach structure that had existed for almost her entire tennis life at a moment when no one could know whether that change would free her or make the final dream drift away forever. At the beginning of 2013, Marion Bartoli made a decision that from the outside might look like an ordinary coaching change, but for her it was almost like dismantling a part of the structure that had kept the entire career standing for many years. Walter was not only a coach, he was the person who had been present in almost every important stage of Marion's tennis life. Therefore, the father and daughter ending the full-time coach-player relationship could not be understood merely as replacing a name in the coaching box. Marion still loved her father, still respected what he had built, and did not deny Walter's role in taking her from a girl with an unusual style of play to the world number 7. But precisely because that relationship was so deep, stepping out of it was all the more difficult. There are painful changes that do not happen because one side is wrong and the other is right. Sometimes people have to leave a structure that once saved them simply because it no longer helps them advance further. Marion entered 2013 in exactly that circumstance. She did not want to erase the past, but she also could not continue living as if every answer had to come from the father outside the court. From that point, she began working with other coaches and sources of support, trying new ways of preparing and, more importantly, having to take greater responsibility herself for her own professional choices. That may sound simple for a 28-year-old athlete, but for Marion this was a very large change. For many years, her system had been built around a relationship in which the boundary between family and profession almost did not exist. A bad practice session was not only a matter between player and coach. A failure did not end when the two people left the court, because that coach was still her father. Now, Marion had to learn a different way of living in tennis, being able to listen to new voices without feeling she was betraying the person who had taught her from the beginning, being able to change without denying what had been effective, being able to decide more for herself without turning independence into a rebellion. This was a difficult step of maturity because true independence does not always require an angry breakup. Sometimes it is only the moment a person understands that she must carry the weight of the decisions that were previously shared. In the months that followed, Marion tried working with different coaches, including Nicolas Perrault, Gabriel Urpi, and a short period with Yana Novotná, before Amélie Mauresmo became an important source of support around Wimbledon. Those changes made 2013 look nothing like a season perfectly prepared for a Grand Slam title. On the contrary, it resembled a transitional period, a year in which Marion was trying to find stability again while the entire familiar structure had just changed. But precisely in that instability, she began to show something important. What Walter had created did not disappear simply because he no longer held the full-time coaching role. The two-handed forehand was still there. The two-handed backhand was still there. The ability to take the ball early, the reflexes, the determination and the thousands of hours of practice still lived in Marion's body. The father could step away from the coach's position, but he could not be erased from the player his daughter had become. What Marion needed to learn was not how to play without Walter's imprint. She needed to learn how to own those imprints as her own. That is a very large difference. In the past, whenever people asked about Marion's game, Walter almost always appeared in the explanation. Now the responsibility gradually shifted to her. When the tactics were right, Marion had to believe in her own choices. When the match went badly, she had to adjust more herself. When a plan did not work, she could not simply wait for a familiar structure to bring her back. That freedom was both liberating and frightening. It meant that if she failed, there was no longer an old system to blame. But if she succeeded, that success would also belong to Marion in a way she had rarely been given completely before. By the summer, Wimbledon arrived when not many people viewed Bartoli as the strongest contender. She was 28 years old, had not returned to a Grand Slam final for 6 years, and had just gone through one of the largest changes of her career. But perhaps precisely because of that, the tournament came at a special moment. Marion was no longer the young girl trying to prove her father's method was right. She was also no longer simply the woman trapped in the question of whether she would ever return to the place that had left the greatest pain. She stepped into Wimbledon with everything Walter had given her, but this time she had to carry it in her own way. No one could know that only a few weeks later, the change that seemed full of risk would lead Marion back to center court. And this time, she would not stand there merely to watch someone else lift the trophy. And then Wimbledon 2013 began. At a moment when not many people saw Marion Bartoli as a face capable of standing until the end on center court. She was 28 years old, had gone through 6 years since her first final appearance, had just changed her coaching structure, and entered the tournament with many questions still unanswered. But the most notable thing in that journey was not a single match, but the almost cold stability that Marion maintained from the first round all the way to the final. She did not drop a single set throughout the entire tournament. With each round that passed, Bartoli's game increasingly showed something people had seen for many years but had never fully believed. That unusual style of play was not only enough to survive at the highest level, it was enough to control a Grand Slam. Marion stood close to the baseline, took the ball early, hit flat, and continuously made her opponents lose time. Her returns did not merely send the ball back into the court, they immediately turned the opponent's first serve into the start of a defensive battle. The movements between points remained the same, those small bouncing steps, those air swings of the racket, the body refusing to stand still, as if Marion had to keep herself in a state of absolute concentration until the match ended. What had once been viewed with curious eyes now became part of a system operating almost perfectly. She defeated Elina Svitolina, Christina Mikhail, Camila Giorgi, Kirin Knapp, Sloane Stephens and then Kirsten Flipkens to return to the Wimbledon final. There was no need to turn each round into a separate story, because the most frightening thing for those on the other side of the net was that Bartoli almost never wavered. 6 years earlier, she had reached the final as a surprise. This time, she arrived there as someone who had lived long enough with disappointment to understand that a second chance must not be wasted. Her opponent in the final was Sabine Lisicki, who had had an emotional journey and had just beaten Serena Williams on the way to center court. Lisicki had power, a big serve and strong support from the crowd after those dramatic matches. But the final unfolded at a completely different rhythm. While Lisicki struggled with the pressure of the biggest moment of her career, Marion stepped into the match with concentration that barely changed. She did not try to create prettier tennis than necessary. She simply continued doing what had brought her there, reading the serve, returning early, forcing the opponent to hit one more shot, and not giving Lisicki enough time to settle her emotions. After losing the first game, Bartoli immediately took control. She won several games in a row, broke Lisicki's rhythm, and closed the first set 6-1. On a court where so many people had collapsed under pressure, Marion looked as if she had spent her whole life preparing for that very afternoon. The second set was harder. Lisicki fought back. The crowd began to feel the match was not yet completely over. And as the score drew closer, the memory of 6 years earlier may have been present somewhere in the distance between Marion and the trophy. But if 2007 had been the story of a girl who went too far and could not complete the final step, then in 2013 Marion was different. She no longer needed to prove she belonged on center court. She only needed to finish the job. At championship point, Bartoli hit a serve wide and the ball passed Lisicki for an ace. No long rally, no lucky shot, no moment of chaos. One serve, one clean point, and 6 years of waiting ended in a few seconds. Marion Bartoli won 6-1, 6-4. The woman who had once had to stand beside Venus Williams and watch someone else lift the trophy in 2007 was now the one being handed the Venus Rosewater dish. She became Wimbledon champion without dropping a single set in the entire tournament. Everything that had once made Marion seem unlike a champion suddenly became exactly what had created that champion. The two-handed forehand did not disappear. The two-handed backhand was not fixed to look like anyone else's. The movements between points were still there. The intensity, the reflexes, and the ability to take the ball early remained the foundation of the victory. Marion did not need to become a more acceptable version of herself to win Wimbledon. She won with exactly the game that many people had spent years doubting. And when the greatest moment finally arrived, Walter was still there. He was no longer his daughter's full-time coach, but the change at the beginning of the year could not erase nearly 2 decades before that. After the match, Marion went to the family and close ones area. The father who had once taken a 6-year-old girl out onto the court, who had spent many years building a style of play regarded as unusual, now saw his daughter standing at the top of Wimbledon. There was no need to turn that moment into proof that Walter had been right in every decision. The more beautiful thing lay in the fact that Marion had been able to grow up, separate from him in the role of coach, and still carry the best of what he had given her. The final trophy belonged to her, but its history still contained the fingerprints of both father and daughter. Yet right on the day that should have belonged only to Bartoli's talent and perseverance, another story appeared. BBC commentator John Inverdale caused controversy by bringing Marion's appearance into the discussion after the victory, with a remark that angered many people because a female athlete who had just achieved the greatest accomplishment of her career was still being judged by whether she fit some standard of beauty. Bartoli did not let that comment steal her day. She knew she had just done something very few people in the world had ever done: win Wimbledon. But the incident left a paradox that was hard to ignore. For many years, people had asked whether her game was pretty enough, correct enough, enough like a champion. When she finally proved all those questions meaningless, the judging eyes shifted to the very appearance of the woman holding the trophy. Marion still stood there, the champion, asking no one's permission to be proud of herself. And if life worked like a fairy tale, that should have been the moment everything began to become easier. More Grand Slams, more seasons at the top, more years to enjoy the position she had fought so long to win. No one looking at Marion that day had reason to think her career was almost at its end. But less than 6 weeks later, when the memory of center court was still fresh, and the Wimbledon title still made her name mentioned as a champion stepping into a new chapter, Marion Bartoli would make a decision that stunned the entire tennis world. The future that everyone had just imagined for her would never happen the way they expected. Cincinnati, August 2013. Just over a month after becoming Wimbledon champion, Marion Bartoli stepped onto the court with a title she had waited almost her entire career to have, but her body began telling her a completely different truth. After the loss to Simona Halep, Marion did not talk about needing to fix tactics, did not talk about the next tournament, and also did not try to turn that defeat into a temporary setback. She announced her retirement at the age of 28, while still the reigning Wimbledon champion. That was one of the most cruel turns in Bartoli's story because everything happened too fast. Only a few weeks earlier, the world had still thought she had just opened the biggest chapter of her career. After 6 years of waiting, after seasons good enough to keep hoping but not enough to touch a Grand Slam trophy, Marion had finally achieved what her entire tennis life had aimed for. And then almost immediately, she had to leave the very sport that had brought her there. Bartoli explained that her body hurt in too many places. After a period of competing, the physical demands had become too much to bear. She spoke of pain in the Achilles, the shoulder, the hip, the lower back, and many other areas, of the feeling that her body no longer allowed her to keep repeating the competitive cycle as before. This was not a single injury that could be operated on, recovered from, and returned after a few months. There was no clear moment to point to and say that it had ended everything. It was the accumulation. Many years of competing, training, traveling, changing surfaces, recovering and then stepping back onto the court. What the body could absorb in youth was not always something that could continue to be absorbed forever. And what made that ending more painful was that it had no clear villain, no scandal, no suspension, no opponent who stepped up and took the career out of Marion's hands, no single large enough incident for people to hate or blame. Her body simply no longer wanted to pay the price that professional tennis demanded. That was the kind of ending that people find hard to accept because we usually want every tragedy to have a clear cause, want to know who did it, want a moment that if changed, everything could have been different. But with Bartoli, the answer was far more uncomfortable. Sometimes no one takes away what you love. Sometimes it is the biological limits of the body that decide the journey has been long enough. That paradox was especially cruel for Marion because the body that outsiders had once commented on, that had been compared to other models, was the very body that had taken her to Wimbledon. Those legs had helped her stand close to the baseline and take the ball early. Those shoulders had endured thousands of hours of hitting with both hands. Those reflexes, that endurance, that ability to maintain intensity, had turned a girl regarded as unusual into a Grand Slam champion. But not long after completing the greatest task, that same body said it could not continue. Marion did not have the chance to take advantage of the Wimbledon title the way people usually imagine. There were not many seasons to compete with new confidence. There was no long period to step onto the court as a champion and see how having reached the top would change her. There was no ordinary opportunity to turn Wimbledon 2013 into the foundation for a new chapter. The trophy became the peak and almost simultaneously became the full stop. That did not make the victory smaller. On the contrary, it gave that victory an additional painful meaning. Marion may have been closer to her limit than anyone realized while she was producing the most consistent performance of her life. And this is also where her entire career began to be looked at in a different way. The years of keeping herself in the top 20, the travels, the successive seasons, the attempts to play one more tournament, one more match, one more set, did not only create ranking and titles, they also created the load that the body had to carry. Marion did not need to hate tennis to leave tennis. She also did not need to lose ambition. Sometimes a person still loves what they are doing but understands that that love cannot forever overcome physical limits. That is why her retirement announcement carried an almost unreal feeling. A new Wimbledon champion, only 28 years old, still in the period when many people thought she could compete for many more years, suddenly stepped off the tour without a long farewell, without a farewell season, and without time for the audience to prepare. But perhaps the greatest change did not take place in front of the cameras or in the press room. It came the next morning, then the mornings after that. For the first time since she was a little girl, Marion could wake up without needing to think about the next tournament. No ranking to protect, no draw about to be announced, no flight to the next city, no practice session organized around a match that had not yet happened. For most of her life, her time had always been directed forward, the next point, the next match, the next week. Now, that cycle disappeared. And if tennis had once filled her childhood, her youth, her identity, and almost the entire way Marion measured the value of progress, then the silence after retirement would force her to face a question that no trophy could answer. When she was no longer a player preparing for the next match, who would Marion Bartoli be? But that question did not immediately turn the days after retirement into tragedy. On the contrary, in the early period, Marion Bartoli publicly spoke of the feeling of relief and happiness at no longer having to live according to the harsh rhythm of the tour. After almost her entire life being divided into practice sessions, flights, draws, rankings, recovery, and the next match, she could finally wake up without needing to check what her body had to endure today in preparation for tomorrow. No more pressure to maintain ranking. No more worry that a bad week of competition could ruin months of accumulation. No more feeling that every meal, every sleep, and every training hour had to serve a match that had not yet taken place. For Marion, that freedom at first brought a kind of peace she had rarely had the chance to experience during her professional years. She began directing her curiosity toward other fields, especially fashion and design, worlds that allowed her to create without an immediate scoreboard judging the result. She also appeared in the media, working as a commentator and tennis analyst, keeping a connection with the sport that had made her name but no longer having to step onto the court to prove her value through victories. This was a process more important than its outward appearance. For many years, Marion had known very clearly who she was every morning: a professional tennis player. Her work had specific goals: train to be stronger, prepare to win the match, protect ranking, go deeper in the next tournament. Even when failure was painful, that system still gave her a direction: lose today, then analyze tomorrow. Body tired, then recover. This tournament ended, and the schedule already had another city waiting ahead. Retirement erased that entire structure almost overnight. And freedom, when a person has lived too long inside discipline, can sometimes create a void that is hard to name. It was not that Marion regretted the decision to leave tennis. Her body had shown its limits very clearly, but knowing she could no longer continue competing did not mean she immediately knew who she should become afterward. She could design, she could do television, she could talk about tennis instead of competing. She could enjoy days no longer governed by the sports clock. But none of those activities immediately replaced the feeling the old profession had once given. Every day had a measurable goal. The change also appeared on Marion's body in a way that at first was entirely natural. An athlete who no longer trained to compete on the WTA Tour would not need to maintain the same volume of strength training, conditioning, and recovery as before. The body changes when the work changes. The lines built to withstand hours of high-intensity movement do not necessarily have to be kept when that goal disappears. But for a woman who had spent most of her youth in an environment where every kilogram, every training session, and every physical metric could be observed, learning to exist in a body no longer optimized for competition was also a separate psychological process. Marion had once understood her body mainly through function, whether it was strong enough to play 3 sets, whether it was fast enough to take the ball early, whether it recovered in time for the next day. Now she had to learn a different relationship with it, one no longer based entirely on the ability to win. And this is precisely where Marion's second life began to become more complicated. Wimbledon had answered a question she had pursued for nearly her entire career. Was she good enough to become a Grand Slam champion? The answer was yes, but that trophy could not answer the next question: how must a champion live when she is no longer competing? The title could follow her name for the rest of her life, but it could not organize the schedule every morning, could not decide where she should find joy, and could not create a new identity to replace the one that had been formed since she was 6 years old. There is a particular loneliness in that transitional period. When an athlete is still competing, the whole world seems to know what to ask. What is the next tournament? What are the goals for this season? Who is the next opponent? When they stop, the questions become larger and sometimes more frightening. What do you want now? What will you do with your time? Who are you still if the thing that made the whole world know you is no longer your daily work? Marion tried to answer by expanding her life. She explored fashion, design, media, new projects, and a rhythm of life that no longer had to be built around the scoreboard. From the outside, this could look like a gentle chapter after the tense years, and in many moments it probably truly was. But identity transition rarely happens through a single decision. A person can leave the old job in one day, but still need many years to separate the sense of self-worth from the standards that job had placed on them. Marion had spent nearly 2 decades learning to measure progress by results. Now life no longer provided a ranking table to tell her she was going in the right direction. Around 2014, when she entered a new relationship, Marion was still in exactly that fragile stage, a champion who had left the system that had defined almost her entire life, a woman learning to live in a body that no longer served tennis, and a person trying to rebuild meaning for days that no longer began with the question of where the next match would take place. And precisely while she was learning to see herself beyond achievements, another voice would enter Marion's life and begin to change the way she looked at her own body. What made the next stage in Marion Bartoli's life painful was not that the whole world suddenly turned its back on her, but something far more private. Later, Marion herself recounted that in a relationship that began after she retired, her former boyfriend frequently told her she was fat and compared her body with thinner women. For a woman who had once stood on center court, who had heard thousands of people applaud, who had held the trophy that nearly the entire tennis world dreamed of, it is easy for outsiders to think that a few words in a relationship could not shake her. But the recognition of the crowd and the injury in private life do not operate in the same way. A stadium can call you a champion, but if the person you allow into the most private space continuously says that your body is not good enough, those words can slip into places the applause never reaches. Marion had already had her appearance turned into a public topic right after the greatest achievement of her career, and now, according to her own account, that same sensitive point appeared again in a closer relationship where the remarks did not come from a distant commentator, but from the person present in daily life. That difference is huge. An insult from a stranger can make you angry. A judgment repeated by someone close can begin to change the way you look in the mirror. Marion recounted that she was compared with women who had thinner bodies, as if her value could be placed next to another shape and then scored. And what was especially cruel was that Bartoli had spent nearly her whole life living in an environment that already turned the body into a tool that needed constant evaluation. While competing, the body was measured by strength, speed, recovery ability, and performance. After retirement, she was learning to escape those numbers. But if during that period another person made her feel that her body still needed to be fixed in order to become acceptable, the distance between freedom and insecurity could become very fragile. Marion no longer needed to return to the gym to play 3 sets the next day, but now she could face a different kind of pressure. Not whether the body was strong enough to win a match, but whether it was thin enough to be looked at with gentler eyes. Exactly here, her story becomes especially poignant because Wimbledon could not protect her from that. A trophy can prove ability, will, and discipline. It does not create armor against every word in emotional life. Athletic achievement can make millions of people admire, but it does not guarantee that a person will always feel safe in her own body. Over time, Marion's appearance began to change markedly. She became thinner, and that change quickly attracted the attention of the press and the public. Photographs began to be scrutinized, weight became a topic, and once again Bartoli's body was pulled out of her own privacy to become something others debated. What is worth noting is that at this moment, it is very easy for a public story to be simplified into a convenient conclusion. She became thin because of pressure, she must have an eating disorder, or that relationship directly created every later health problem. But such conclusions go beyond what Marion publicly confirmed. She has spoken about the critical remarks in the relationship and the negative impact on the way she viewed her body. That does not mean she can be diagnosed from the outside, nor does it mean every physical change afterward had a single cause. Human life is rarely that simple. Emotions, body image, habits, social pressure, and health conditions can coexist without being arbitrarily assembled into a certain causal chain. What we know more clearly is that Marion passed through this period with a self-image challenged in a very different way from tennis. On the court, she always knew who the opponent was. She had tactics, a scoreboard, and an ending point. In a relationship that made her doubt her own body, the boundaries were not so clear. There was no umpire to say when a remark had crossed the limit. There was no set point to signal that the match was about to end. There was no ranking to prove that someone else's judgment of her was wrong. Perhaps that is one of the saddest paradoxes of Marion. She had spent decades learning not to let external doubts change her game, but in private life, intimate words could go deeper than any boos from the stands, and as her body changed more and more, the outside gaze became more intense. The public saw the photographs and asked what was happening. The press focused on weight. The discussions increasingly no longer related to tennis, design, or media work, but revolved around how Marion looked. For a woman who had once been judged for not fitting the imagined model of a champion, this was almost a repetition of an old wound in a new circumstance. Before, she was asked why her body did not look like the athlete people imagined. Now, when the body became thinner, that very change became a source of worry and judgment. It seemed that no matter the state, a famous female athlete still found it very hard to fully reclaim the right to exist without her body being turned into a public topic. But then the story moved to a far more serious level. Because what Marion began to speak about publicly afterward was no longer only about body image, critical remarks, or the way others looked at her weight. She began to talk about health problems that made eating and daily living difficult, about bodily reactions that she herself did not fully understand, and about a fear that was no longer related to how she looked in other people's eyes. The change in appearance now no longer only made the world ask why Marion Bartoli had become thin. It opened a far more frightening question: what was really happening with her health? By 2016, the story of Marion Bartoli was no longer only the story of a former Wimbledon champion trying to adapt to life after tennis. Her appearance had changed dramatically, her weight had dropped markedly, and public concern began to go beyond ordinary comments about looks. People saw a Marion much thinner than in her playing days, and this time she herself also acknowledged that something serious was happening with her body. At Wimbledon that year, Bartoli was scheduled to take part in the invitation doubles, an occasion for former players to return to the court in a lighter atmosphere than the professional years. But she could not compete for health reasons. That was the moment the problem could no longer be viewed as a mere change in physique. Marion publicly said she was battling what she described as a mystery virus, a condition that according to her made the body react abnormally to many things that had previously been completely normal. What she recounted sounded frightening because it did not fall into a familiar sports injury. It was not an ankle that needed a few weeks of rest. It was not a painful shoulder that could be treated with physical therapy. Marion spoke about the body not tolerating many types of food, making the diet become extremely restricted. Ordinary meals became sources of anxiety. Daily activities that most people never have to think about also became decisions that required caution. According to Bartoli, she had to avoid many kinds of food and felt the body react to things that previously caused no problem. The control she had once had over her body as an athlete seemed to disappear. In tennis, Marion could train to become stronger, change tactics to adapt, adjust the schedule to recover. But this time, she herself admitted she did not fully understand what was happening. That was a very different form of powerlessness for someone who had spent a lifetime believing that discipline and analysis could produce answers. Marion also rejected the simple explanation that she actively wanted to become thin like that. She emphasized that this condition was not an aesthetic goal, but something happening against her will. That was very important, because when a famous woman loses weight too quickly, the public often wants to immediately put a label on the story. But what Bartoli described in 2016 was a health issue that she herself believed had causes beyond her control, and she did not accept others turning it into a simple choice about appearance. She had once been judged because her body did not match the image people expected of a tennis player. Now, when her body changed in the opposite direction, it again became the object of judgment. But this time Marion was not only facing the discomfort of being scrutinized, she was truly afraid. In an interview, when asked whether she feared she could die, Bartoli answered yes. She spoke of the fear that one day her heart could stop beating. Those words need to be understood at the level she herself described. That was Marion's fear in a time of unstable health, not evidence that she had been determined to be close to death. But even while keeping that boundary, the level of despair in her account was still very great. A woman who had once stepped onto center court with thousands of people looking at her, who had once held her nerves steady enough to close a Wimbledon final with an ace, now had to live with the question of how her body might react after a meal or an ordinary day. Marion's opponent at this time had no name on the scoreboard. There was no match schedule. There was no tactics prepared the night before. And the scariest thing was that she did not clearly know when that battle would end. The uncertainty itself made everything heavier. In sports, no matter how great the pressure, at least a match has structure. There is the first point, there are sets, there is match point, there is a moment of ending. A health crisis did not give Marion that clarity. Each day could bring a new reaction. Each type of food could become a question. Each change on her body made outsiders discuss further while she herself was still trying to understand herself. Bartoli had built her career on the ability to analyze continuously, but this time not every piece of data led to a simple answer. Treatment therefore became the priority. Marion began to devote time to taking care of her health, trying to recover and find stability again. The story did not change in one night. There was no single moment when everything suddenly returned to normal. But over time, positive signs began to appear. Her body gradually had a better ability to recover, and along with her health, a part of the competitive spirit that had seemed to disappear also began to return. This was something notable about Marion. After having retired because of physical pain, after going through years of searching for a new identity, after the period in which she publicly admitted she feared for her own life, her thoughts finally began to turn back to the most familiar place, the tennis court. Not immediately as a playing plan, not yet a specific comeback schedule, just a thought gradually appearing as she got healthier. Could she hold a racket again? Could the body that had once made her afraid once more become something she trusted? And more importantly, could tennis carry a different meaning from before? When she was young, Marion played to win, to climb the rankings, to prove that her style of play could exist, to win a Grand Slam. After 2016, if she returned, the goal would no longer be that simple, because after having feared that she could lose her ordinary life itself, stepping back onto the court could become proof of something more fundamental than any title. Before Marion spoke about returning to the tour, before she began those grueling practice sessions and set competitive goals once more, a thought had formed in her. Tennis might no longer be the place to prove she was a champion. It could become the place to prove to herself that she still had enough vitality to begin again. When Marion Bartoli began to speak seriously about returning to tennis, her motivation was no longer like that of the woman who had spent her entire youth chasing rankings and Grand Slams. After what her body had gone through, a comeback carried a meaning that was almost more fundamental. Marion publicly said that she wanted to return to prove to herself that she was still alive, that the body which had once made her afraid could once again run, turn, react, and withstand the intensity of the sport that had defined nearly her entire life. Therefore, the plan to return was not an emotional statement that then disappeared after a few weeks. Bartoli truly began training seriously. Long hitting sessions returned. Conditioning was put into the schedule. Her body had to relearn the movements that had once been instinct but had been left behind after many years without professional competition. Marion had gone through a period when even normal eating had become a source of anxiety. Now she was asking that same body to endure many hours of tennis every day. That was a major transformation, and at first it brought hope. The more she trained, the more Marion felt she could do a little more. The practice sessions were no longer merely symbolic. She aimed at returning to real competition, with the goal of appearing again at the big tournaments and checking whether a Wimbledon champion who had left the tour for many years could still stand in the professional environment. Encouragement from people who understood very clearly the price of top-level tennis also made that plan feel more real. Monica Seles, who had once influenced the way Walter built Marion's game from childhood, encouraged her. Serena Williams also gave Bartoli support during the difficult years and encouraged the intention to return. For Marion, those were not merely beautiful words from two big names. Both understood how difficult it is for an athlete to rebuild trust in the body, and Marion began to act like a player preparing to return to the tour, rather than a former champion who only wanted to play a few exhibition matches. She spent many hours on court, combining tennis with physical training and trying to raise her endurance step by step. There were days when the workload stretched almost the entire day, when tennis, conditioning, and recovery were added together. What was notable was that her body truly withstood more than what a few years earlier had made Marion herself despair. Each completed practice session became a small piece of evidence that the woman who had once feared her heart could stop beating still had the ability to fight. And that itself made hope grow. The comeback went from an idea to a plan. The plan became a training schedule. The training schedule began to create the vision that Marion Bartoli could truly walk through the tunnel of a WTA tournament once more. But top-level tennis has a very cruel way of distinguishing between can play and can compete professionally. A person can hit balls well for many hours, can run, train physically, and feel much healthier than before. But the tour requires the body to repeat that continuously under pressure, through many days, many weeks, on different surfaces and against opponents who do not allow any weakness to be hidden. As the training load increased, Marion's right shoulder began to become a problem. The pain returned and gradually showed a limit that willpower could not simply force past. This was the point that made the story painful, but also much more mature than the first time she left tennis. Marion had lived most of her career with the belief that more discipline, more training, one more effort could create an answer. But by 2018, she understood more clearly that there are times when continuing is not the only expression of courage. In June of that year, Bartoli announced that she was abandoning the comeback plan because the shoulder problem made meeting the demands of top-level tennis no longer realistic. There was no humiliation in that decision. There was also no reason to call it a personal failure. Marion had tried. She had brought her body from a state that had once made her fear for her health back to a level where she could train seriously as an athlete. She had built enough confidence to think about the big tournaments once more. But in the end, the right shoulder gave the answer she could not negotiate. The difference was that this time Marion listened to it. She did not need to force her body to the point of destroying something more just to prove that she was still strong. Perhaps that itself was the greatest evidence that she had changed. Previously, tennis had taught Marion that value lay in enduring one more point, one more set, one more season. Life after tennis taught her that sometimes knowing when to stop at the right moment is also a form of victory. The comeback did not bring Bartoli back onto the rankings, did not create another Grand Slam, and did not open a second competitive chapter as she had once hoped. But it had done something very close to her original motivation. Marion had proven to herself that she could return to the court, could train, could use her body in the way she had once thought lost, and could dream once more. When the competition dream closed in June 2018, she no longer stood before the same void as in 2013. This time Marion had learned that life does not necessarily have to be measured by how many matches she can still win. And when she actively accepted the limits of her body instead of continuing to fight against it, another chapter began to open, where tennis was still in Marion Bartoli's life, but no longer had to be the only place that decided who she was. After closing the dream of returning to competition, Marion Bartoli entered a phase in which her life no longer needed to be organized around the question of whether her body was strong enough for the next match. Tennis was still there, but for the first time in many years, it was no longer the sole center around which every decision had to revolve. At the end of 2019, Marion married Yahya Boumediene, a Belgian soccer player, opening a new private chapter that she chose to live outside the pressure of rankings and the debates that had once clung to her career. There is no need to turn that marriage into a fairy tale or to see Yahya as someone who came to save Marion from the difficult years. What she had gone through before could not be erased merely by a new relationship. The physical injuries, the years of losing direction after retirement, the health crisis and the comeback effort all still belonged to her history. But they no longer had to be the entire story. In December 2020, Marion and Yahya welcomed their daughter Camelia. For a woman who had spent most of her life defining herself by results, the arrival of a child brought a completely different kind of responsibility and meaning. Motherhood has no scoreboard. There is no ranking to tell Marion how many places better she did today than yesterday. There is no trophy certifying that a difficult day has been handled perfectly. That very difference helped her life expand into a region that tennis had never taught her how to measure. Camelia did not need Marion to be a Wimbledon champion every morning. To her daughter, she was first of all a mother. That is an identity that does not depend on whether the body is still strong enough to play 3 sets, does not depend on appearance being judged by others, and also does not disappear when a match ends in defeat. But motherhood should not be told as a cloth covering all that had once been painful. Marion did not become a different person without a past. She only gained an additional part of life large enough that the difficult years no longer occupied the entire frame. At the same time, she still did not leave tennis. Bartoli continued to appear in broadcasting, commentating and analyzing tournaments, using the very experience that had been built through many years on the tour to explain what was happening before the audience's eyes. She also took part in coaching and mentoring, including having worked with players such as Jelena Ostapenko. That role created a very different relationship with the sport that had once controlled nearly her entire living schedule. When she was competing, tennis required Marion to put her body into every point. When commentating, she could use memory, experience, and analytical ability without paying the same physical price. When coaching or advising, she could pass on what she had learned without needing to step onto the court herself to win. Tennis, therefore, did not disappear from Marion. It was only placed in a healthier position within the larger picture of her life. That became even clearer when Camelia began to get acquainted with the racket. Marion has publicly shared joyful moments related to her daughter playing tennis, even expressing pride when Camelia took part and had the first results at a young age. But at this stage, there is no need to turn a child into a project for a future career. What is more notable is the way Marion can look at tennis from a completely different position. The sport that had once been a duty, a profession, a source of pain, and a place where she had to prove herself can now simply be a family activity, a game, a joy that she shares with her child. There is a very great freedom in that change. For many years, Marion could only step into tennis with her entire self. Every defeat was recorded, every physical change was observed, every decision could become a debate. Now, she can step into the commentary booth, go to a practice session, support a player, or hold a racket with her daughter, and then return to a life not decided by what has just happened on the court. That is perhaps one of the deepest signs that Marion has truly moved far from the woman who used to wake up every morning with a tournament ahead. She did not abandon tennis in order to be free, nor did she return to competition in order to prove she still had value. She found a position in between. close enough for that sport still to belong to her, but far enough that it no longer owns her entire self. And for the first time since she was a little girl, Marion Bartoli can step into tennis and then step out of tennis without needing to ask herself whether the result of that day has increased or decreased her value. Scoreboard can record a great many things about Marion Bartoli. It can record that she was once the world number 7. It can record that she once reached the Wimbledon final and then 6 years later returned to become the champion. It can preserve the victories, the titles, the numbers that tennis history uses to define a successful career. But the scoreboard cannot record the feeling of a person when her own body no longer allows her to continue. It cannot record the years of having to relearn how to look at herself after the applause disappeared. It cannot record the fear about health, the wounds in her private life, or the feeling of having to rebuild her identity when the thing that once defined her entire life is no longer her daily work. That is the true meaning of Marion Bartoli's 2 lives. Not a scandal that was hidden, not a secret that made other people feel deceived, but 2 measures existing together inside one person. One public life judged by performance, ranking, victories and trophies. One private life that has to face limits, self-image, health, and the question of who she still is when all the familiar numbers disappear. Walter Bartoli gave Marion a very important first lesson. Being different does not mean being wrong. He believed that his daughter did not need to play tennis like the majority in order to succeed, and that belief was finally proven on center court. But the years after Wimbledon forced Marion to teach herself a much harder lesson. A person also does not need to keep winning in order to keep her value intact. There is a beautiful thread running all the way through that story. Long ago, Marion was a little girl about 6 years old holding a racket under her father's guidance, learning to believe in a game that other people might not understand. Many years later, she can again watch her daughter Camelia begin to get familiar with tennis. No one knows how far Camelia will go with that sport, and there is no need to know. What matters is not whether a new generation will continue to produce champions or not. What matters is that tennis can now be passed on as a joy, a family memory, a part of life instead of a duty to prove one's worth. That is perhaps a greater legacy than any trophy. Marion once had to defend the right to play tennis in her own way. After that, she still had to defend a harder right, the right to live without letting tennis, appearance, or other people's judgments decide entirely who she is. While she was still competing, she had to prove that her 2-handed forehand, her unusual movements, and her own way of preparing could survive at the highest level. After leaving the tour, the battle changed. She had to learn that a body does not only have value when it is strong enough to win matches, that identity does not disappear when ranking disappears, that stopping is not always surrender, and that a comeback that does not reach the destination can still carry meaning if it helps a person find faith in herself again. Wimbledon proved that Marion Bartoli could become a champion. But the part of life after Wimbledon shows what the trophy cannot fully say. She could lose the profession that had organized almost her entire life. She could go through words that wounded the way she saw herself. She could face a period of health that made her publicly admit she was afraid. She could train to come back, and then have to accept that her shoulder was no longer suited to the demands of top-level tennis. And after all of that, she could still continue building a life with family, work, motherhood, and a new relationship with the sport that had once occupied almost every empty space. Perhaps that is the most worthy part to honor in Marion Bartoli's story. Not that she was always strong, not that she never fell, but that after the familiar measures disappeared one by one, she still found a way to live without needing the scoreboard to say she was winning. The Wimbledon silver plate will always prove that Marion Bartoli was once a tennis champion. But her life after the day she lifted that trophy proves something larger. A person can still keep her value intact even when there is no longer any scoreboard confirming it. What makes Marion Bartoli's story leave so much sorrow is not that she lacked success, but the paradox that even when she had achieved what millions of athletes dream of, she still had to fight to keep the feeling that she had value. Marion once rose to number 7 in the world. defeated Justine Henin, Serena Williams, and Victoria Azarenka. Then in 2013 won Wimbledon without dropping a single set, but only 39 days later, at the age of 28, she had to leave tennis because her body could no longer bear the demands of the tour. After that came more difficult years. The criticism about her weight in a relationship that Marion herself later publicly recounted, the physical changes that made the public scrutinize her, then the health crisis in 2016 serious enough that she admitted she was afraid there might come a day when her heart could stop beating. The most painful part is that a person who once controlled every ball on center court at times could not understand what was happening to her own body. But Marion did not end there. She trained for a comeback. Then in 2018 was clear-headed enough to stop when her right shoulder could no longer meet the demands of top-level tennis. For Americans living in a culture that often glorifies achievement, productivity, and never giving up, that story reminds us that resilience does not always mean continuing at all costs. Sometimes courage lies in knowing the limits, leaving a path that once defined you, and rebuilding life with other values. Marion later became a wife, mother of Camellia, commentator, advisor, and can still step into tennis without needing the scoreboard to decide how much she is worth. Wimbledon proved she is a champion. But the way Marion has lived after Wimbledon is what makes me truly respect her. She learned that even when the body changes, the profession ends, and the applause falls silent, a person's dignity does not diminish at all. If Marion Bartoli's story makes you look at victory, failure, and the value of a human being in a different way, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a heart so that together we can honor the woman who proved that life does not need a scoreboard to confirm that we are still winning. Thank you for staying with us until the final minute, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that trophies and applause have never been able to tell fully.